Okay, I think we're ready. I'm calling to order the 47th public meeting of the Mass Gaming Commission on Tuesday, January 22nd, 2013. And I guess we'll jump right to this. Is one of the continuation of conversations about what we've set out as sort of key policy questions, some more key than others. And each commissioner has been assigned some of these topics, and we'll just go down by commissioner, starting with key policy question number 20.
Which is mine, Mr. Chairman. 20 and 35 are both mine, and they both, as you'll see when we get to 35, are something of a work in progress, at least in my mind at this point. Question 20 says, what kind of team with what kinds of skills and competencies does the Commission need to help assess the Phase 2 proposals? We got some comments from two members of the public in response to our request for public comments. Shefsky and Froelich, who represents and are assisting the Springfield process on behalf of the city, recommended an urban planner, a mitigation consultant, a financial consultant, and a traffic consultant to review issues in the Phase 2 application that fell within their respective competencies. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council suggested that the evaluation team include experts in gaming, economic development, transportation, social services, housing, and environmental issues, as well as local, regional, and state representatives, and suggested that the RPAs themselves, the regional planning authorities, associations, would be in a good position to provide advice to the Commission with respect to the Phase 2 proposals. It seemed to me, after looking at that and thinking about the fact that we are now engaged in a process of identifying the criteria that we're going to use for the evaluations ultimately, a process that hopefully we can bring to a conclusion in the near term, that the ultimate determination of what kinds of team members we need will depend on what it is we're trying to evaluate. And so we can't come up with a complete answer to this question right now. It seems clear to me, though, and as I was thinking about this, that we are going to need a financial consultant. There are going to be heavy financial aspects of any RFA2 proposal application we receive. That there might be a need, and we should think about the need for a construction financing consultant, if that's not within the competencies of the overall financial consultant, because construction financing is somewhat different than ongoing financing, operational financing, projections and the like. That an architect and a planner with experience in development of large facilities will be essential to help us think through the viability and attractiveness and things that need mitigation in whatever plan we receive. And a traffic consultant is clearly going to be required because these are going to be heavy draws, each one of them, and we'll need to look at the impact on traffic. And because there will be an impact beyond the immediate surroundings of the facility, somebody with regional planning experience would be helpful to have as a member of the team. Now that may be all we need ultimately, but it seems to me that we ought to think about getting those people with those kinds of competencies on board now, and then revisiting this to see if we have a full complement when we have the final criteria assembled. Insofar as the regional planning authorities are concerned, it seems to me that they too can provide a very valuable resource, and we ought to explore with them, beginning now, how they can provide that assistance to us. The difficulty with relying on them for one of the functions is twofold. One, we really want to be able to make an independent judgment. And secondly, it may be, as things shake down, and not all the players are in place yet, that you have competing facilities in two different regions within a region. So you have conceivably two different regional planning authorities that may be involved in the assessment, and therefore trying to get some kind of comparison objectively viewed by a single entity might be difficult. That's why I think we ought to explore with them how best to get the value that they surely can provide, and begin that now. So those are the three components of the recommendation. There's some that we know now, I think, and we should try to get aboard. We should explore with the regional planning authorities how they can provide the best input to our process, and we ought to revisit the composition of our evaluation team when we're finished with the evaluation criteria we choose to use.
How does this fit? You've sort of had the tacit project of thinking about what we're gonna need. How do these two things fit together?
We're very, very much in line. I think I agree with the fundamental notion, the three notions of this recommendation. I would think about it, or I want to make the following point, which dovetails in exactly just what Commissioner McHugh is thinking about, or recommending, really. I would put three of the expertise here, perhaps in some way overlapping. Construction financing, architects and planners, and traffic consultants. Some of the attributes of those three, they don't overlap all the time, but they sometimes do. And one way to think about it would be for us to let out a request for proposal for those three disciplines in the same document, much like we did with the research agenda, to invite responses from qualified individuals and firms on any one or all three of those disciplines. And the responses to those could be very helpful in helping us determine, first of all, assess the expertise out there that would be interested. And secondly, helping us determine what the composition of those experts would be. I distinguish that solicitation from one of a financial consultant because at least I'm thinking that's a discipline that's very discrete in this case, one that we could emphasize however we wanted, expertise with gaming analysis, with gaming operations, and financial modeling, for example, that could yield some great responses. But as I think of these four broad categories, after I've read this thoughtful summary memo, I thought those three could be thought of as perhaps one that we could solicit and potentially end up with three or more or less advisors, a group of advisors in those disciplines.
John, do we need a traffic consultant? Will we not be able to get that from DOT?
We'll rely on the DOT expertise, but it still may be useful to have our own traffic consultant because there are obviously limitations on resources for how much we can count on from DOT for their staff time. They'll be able to provide us some analysis and some reports, but it's possible that we might want to have somebody with that skill set to help us out and help us analyze the reports that are.
So we should at least have them available to us.
Yep.
In case.
Well, and part of my point is that there are very good planners who might not need to do, need not be traffic experts, but be able to assess a traffic study quite successfully. And I guess as we solicit these things, we may be able to, to be better educated as to what expertise is available.
It seemed to me that I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it seemed to me that was the key. Each of these applications has to contain a plan for dealing with these various kinds of things, including traffic studies and the like. And so the person that we're looking for is somebody who can look at the plans submitted and determine whether it's realistic, whether they've taken into account the right factors, whether they've and then do some kind of a comparative analysis between the two, rather than somebody who's going to go out and do the studies themselves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's many program managers that do this effectively. And you know, they recognize enough, either because they've done it in the past or because they have coordinated efforts in large projects. On the flip side, I also, and I know it's not necessarily what's recommended here, but I would caution, or I would be careful not to have too many discrete advisors and miss a coordinating piece.
Yeah.
And I know it's not what's intended in this memo, but part of my thought of trying to solicit expertise that maybe overlaps may help us in that regard.
That's a good point. I'm wondering from our gaming consultants if there are consultants that do just this, come in and evaluate casino projects, and they have expertise in architect, maybe they've looked at traffic studies, all of the items that Commissioner McHugh just took a look at.
In our experience, I'm not personally aware of any firm that does that specialty, simply working for governments and assessing. What we have seen in various states is that they may use one of a big six accounting firm, for example, to evaluate. And to be perfectly candid, quite often their expertise is not in the nuances of gaming, and they lack what Commissioner Zuniga has referred to as the coordinating the overall perspective in terms of being able to look at all pieces of it. And our experience, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of Michael and Carol as well in this respect, is that what we have seen, where we have been on the side of the applicants in putting forth plans, is that when the assessment was done, it lacked the ability to look beyond what would be a plain vanilla approach and to be able to accurately and adequately assess the nuances and how all the pieces would fit together for a project that essentially is designed and structured to break the mold. That's going to be the challenge. But I don't think you can have any issues or any fears about qualified expertise in all of the areas identified here. They're going to be coming out of the woodwork in terms of this would be a terrific job, but the key is the ability to put it all together and look at it in terms of all aspects of it to see whether it does achieve what it can. But the short answer to your question is we're not aware of any firms that specifically specialize in that on behalf of government.
So we're going to have to look for different experts to help us with different pieces of this.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. What we have seen, or what we certainly could conceive of, is an RFP that allows teams to put their own expertise together in various areas. If the RFP does require that this successful applicant has to have the ability to look at the big picture and assess it holistically, and then the burden would be on them to potentially put together a team.
Thank you.
Just, if I could add one other thing, when the applications are submitted, you know, there's certain degrees of quality in terms of the verifications that are actually put in. So, for example, if you get a traffic study that would show the mitigations and the effect of the particular impact of a traffic program by X size casino, the companies are usually pretty diligent in making sure that the companies that present these things have thought them out. You know, they're signed by appropriately qualified people and so forth. And generally speaking, you get a pretty good product. Now, your review of that in comparison to other applicants and so forth is where the expertise is needed, so that you can look at the different ones and say, but generally speaking, you're going to get a pretty good quality product on those mitigation plans in practically all of these areas. The financial, as Mike's indicated, for example, in Pennsylvania, they had a major Big Six company come in and do it, and there was a fair amount of disagreement by all of the applicants as to the projections that were made. They all made projections. Projections were based on, the equipping and the size of the particular facilities, and there was pretty big divergence in what the applicants, some of which were really experienced, and what they projected, and what the company found as the actual anticipated results. And I think the actual experience in Pennsylvania probably created a third category. It wasn't quite what was put forth by the applicants, nor was it necessarily by what the very conservative numbers that had been returned by the expert, but somewhere in between on factors in some cases that weren't even really properly addressed. So, as Mike pointed out, the company that does this, or a particular firm that does this, has to appreciate the nuances of what is being presented, so that they can take into account a lot of these different things that affect each individual project, and then compare them together and give you an assessment that these financial projections are not only reasonable, but they're also, from a practical standpoint, in their experience, are demonstrated by the size of the property, the number of machines, the operational plan they have, and everything else. So you can find these groups. You're just going to have to pick them out. And I think it would end up being a team. It may be one company that puts together the team, but it will be separate disciplines within that team.
Wouldn't it be helpful, I'm thinking as I heard you and Mike talking, I thought about this a little bit earlier, wouldn't it be helpful to have the team, or whether assembled by a single entity or assembled by us, on board before we actually promulgate the application requirements, so that they could help us tailor the application requirements to the ultimate evaluation, and create forms that will permit relevant comparisons?
I would think yes. I think if you could get input from them on areas that, for example, information that would be specific to that discipline, it would be helpful. Bringing them on board, or maybe having an initial consultation in that regard might be sufficient. But I can't imagine it not being helpful.
We decide on the criteria, hypothetically.
Right.
We say these are the criteria we're interested in. We want you to help us evaluate them. Now, help us design the form, the application form, or the information that we need to get in order to emphasize, highlight these criteria, and help us make relevant comparisons between proposals in these various areas.
Yeah, this, to a certain degree, this anticipates question 35.
It does, and that's, yes.
Which I think that assessing the priorities of the public policies, and having an advisor that can help identify and help rank those public policies in advance could certainly be helpful.
And the reason I raise that now is that I wonder how long an RFP process will take, or whether we can't, in some way, without doing violence to our commitment to openness, transparency, and the other important things that we're trying to achieve, couldn't find a way to speed that up so that we get at least the core of some kind of a team on board before we're at a stage early enough, so that when the regs are issued, their input can be.
When would that be, date-wise, more or less?
Well, the target date for issuing the regs is
March 14th.
mid-March, let's say.
I can't imagine us getting it done enough before that it could appreciably affect that. It could do it ex post facto. You could have them, review it during their appeal period and so forth, during the hearings period and so forth. But I can't imagine, that would mean by mid-February, you'd have to have somebody on board to help you substantively.
Right, that's a month, but basically a month from now.
Yeah, I think that.
Well, we could structure a solicitation, a quick solicitation for a discrete amount of advice, if you will, or a request for proposal form, let's say, on certain levels of expertise. But I wanted to, if I may just talk about a particular example that's very relevant here, that happened in 2004 with the passage of construction reform in Massachusetts, which mandated an owner's project manager on all public procurements. I'm intimately familiar with that from the school building authority. This owner's project manager was mandated as a result of a lot of difficulties by municipalities managing their architect, who drew the drawings, and their contractor, who actually built the project. This was an advisor to the owner that allowed the owner, in this case a public entity, the ability to weigh and analyze multiple aspects of a very large construction project. And many of the owners' project managers that initially came to this new industry in Massachusetts were already doing this in the private sector, just purely construction management. And but eventually, other firms like architects and planners moved into the space and were quite successful. Again, integrating their ability and expertise, having drawn up drawings and now working for owners and reviewing certain key aspects to the owner, advising the owner. I see this commission as the owner as well, and I see us as requesting expertise from the likes of all these firms that exist in the Commonwealth and elsewhere, that have expertise in multiple areas. Sometimes some are more focused in certain areas, like having a background in architecture and planning, but also expertise in scheduling and construction cost, analyzing, etc. I'm going back to the same point perhaps that I made before, which is if we put together a general RFP for all those disciplines, we could see a number of firms respond quickly that have expertise in multiple of those disciplines. Again, I make the distinction with the financial advisor. I keep thinking that expertise is very different from the other three that we're thinking about, which we could also put out quite quickly and get hopefully some good responses.
But I think that the ideas that you're articulating make great good sense. If we get somebody to either put together a team or manage a team or control a team, it'd be great. It's the speed with which we could get a quality group on board by going through a procurement process that I wonder about, and wonder how we can do it most efficiently. But that's your bailiwick, so.
It's not a small, I mean, the longer, if we have a long, we call it 30-day response period, if we take our time thinking out the RFP and writing it, we were likely to get better responses than if we do it too quickly. But that doesn't take away from our ability to try to do it as quickly as we can.
No, I know we'll try to do it as quickly as we can. It's the values that we're trying to achieve by doing
Well,
it.
it's a practical matter. I think the likelihood of getting very much help prior to March 14th is not great, but we might get some, and we can integrate some of that help. We can after the fact, after March 14th, there's plenty of opportunity to rejigger the proposed regs or the review process or the metrics and the weighting chart and so forth.
Sure.
So I think it's worth, presumptively, let's make that part of this recommendation. It seems to me there's a third part of this. There's the team you need, and there's first of all there's the criteria and the metrics and the measuring tools. Then there's the team to help you do that. But there's also going to be this process. We're going to get, in a relatively short period of time, somewhere up to 11, huge proposals. You've seen some of these things. It's huge proposals with a huge amount of data. And we need to have a process in place by which we are gonna review that. And, I don't know whether that means the first thing is a oral visual presentation, and then we segment it out and we give it out to various consultants at the state, or we bring the state in first, or I don't know. But there ought to be some kind of a process whereby this paperwork flows through some kind of planned review. And otherwise, we're just gonna be swamped in paper and not know what we're doing. So I wanted to ask you all, is there some sort of standard, is there some sort of standard process by which one reviews these kinds of things? You put them through some kind of pipeline of review and analysis, or if there isn't a standard, has one of these most recent states, Pennsylvania or Ohio, done it well? Are there people that we could talk to about what kind of a process?
Ohio, it was the constitutional amendment in Ohio which pre-selected the applicants.
Oh, yeah, right,
Constitutional
right.
amendment, so there was no RFP process like
Yeah.
you have, and same thing for the 7 Racinos, saw machines at the racetracks. It was all pre-done, so they did not have an RFP process which is remotely similar. What other states have, and certainly Singapore has.
I think Illinois might be a better example than
Okay.
Ohio for their
Yeah.
10th license. We, as Spectrum, were involved on the applicant side in both Pennsylvania and Illinois. Got to see it from that perspective. And the answer is there's nothing that we saw that we would suggest would be a good model here for the assessment process, in that we essentially, as part of a team, submitted these very detailed, complex proposals in every aspect. How many people you're going to employ, what the revenues are going to be, and so forth, as well as some other qualitative aspects. And between the time we submitted and the time of a hearing, where you did essentially a PowerPoint presentation as to the salient aspects of your proposal, there may have been one, I don't think there was as many as 2 calls from consultants with respect to the advisors to the respective commissions, asking, how did you achieve these numbers, or anything like that. We were prepared for that. We expected that. We would have welcomed that, but there really wasn't.
I want to address your question to some degree, Mr. Chairman, and at least the way I'm going ahead a little bit in the next memo, if you will, but it looks like we will have a set of broad criteria, call it 5 criteria that could further be refined, 5 or 6 or however many. And those will be rational subgroups, as Commissioner McHugh will later explain. It occurs to me that for those broad criteria, the request for application could be structured in a way that each of those criteria is very discrete. And the advisors and group, which may include groups that may include also RPAs or other stakeholders, will also be very fit well in those discrete groups, is at least my belief. Those could be done and analyzed in tandem, in parallel. Of course, our roles, we'll have to figure that out, and we can get to that later. But I see the bulk of those evaluations taking place in parallel where possible, and with the advice of our consultants here and the ones that we have yet to hire, and others like the RPAs. But as Commissioner McHugh points out, because we're still in the process of defining those criteria, the advisors go hand in hand, but I do believe that they will fit in some way in rational subgroups.
I was going to, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to suggest something very much along the lines of what Commissioner Zuniga just said, that it would be counterproductive.
Near the mic.
It would be counterproductive for me to talk without a microphone.
We'll accept that suggestion.
Be counterproductive for everyone to evaluate everything from scratch. And that a division of labor, both among the consultants that are retained and conceivably among the commissioners themselves, so that at least the initial review of, as Commissioner Zuniga points out, the discrete areas is done by a certain channel, and report on that then brought together as an amalgam with all the other reports, and then so that the commissioners are reviewing something that has been pre-reviewed, and you're seeing what the recommendations are from those who have the expertise in that particular area, rather than you're trying to delve into the details of every one of these segmented portions.
The viability of these proposals in some part depends on how we, not the viability, the facility with which we can do this, depends in some part on how we design the application, right? I mean, if we put a lot of requirements that are apples to apples requirements in the application form, then the processing, at least at our level, becomes easier than if we have sort of an undifferentiated presentment of information.
Absolutely.
Right.
You know, I think that's.
But that gets back to the trying to see if we can figure out a way to get the consultants on board to help us design the application. I mean, it's a seamless.
Right. And I think all three, as you're saying,
Right.
all three of these things fit together.
Right.
Can I also mention another piece relative to your question as to the process? I also think that we will request the responses for RFA Phase 2 and get volumes. They will be discrete, they could be assigned and reported back as Guy summarizes. In my view, after that has gone through to some level of vetting and understanding, it is then that more information request of the applicants may be useful, and we need to think about just exactly how to do that. To ensure that there's comparisons and apples to apples on the one hand. We can think a lot about that, but may end up with potentially different interpretations by the respondents. What would be akin to requesting oral interviews in a public procurement. After some period of analysis, we would then ask, and this is only a suggestion, respondents to come in and either publicly to come in and explain certain portions that we may understand or want to understand more fully, or have our advisors follow up directly. That's a route that we want to take towards understanding better assumptions behind complex financial modeling, for example. Because there will be those assumptions, sometimes they're not quite clear, and that information, in other words, if we had a process for requesting information, clarifying information, and maybe that's all assumed to be the case, after the applications have been reviewed on a cursory level, I believe that would be also very helpful in furthering the goals that you say, trying to do the best analysis in the most efficient time.
Right. A couple of reactions to that. I think that's absolutely right. It would seem that there may be a kind of a three-phase process. You may want to have the applicants make a public presentation at the very outset of Phase 2, where they lay out what they intend prior to any pre-review of what they're submitting, just so the public is aware of what their project in general is intended to look like. And then you go through the review process, as we've talked about. And during that review process, you are free to ask for additional information at any stage or at any moment, because they're required to submit any information you want. both with the consulting elements or staff or state agencies or whoever else is doing that initial review. And then after you've compiled the information that you thought was necessary, then have another public hearing where, you either ask further questions or clarify what it is that they are presenting that it bothers you, ask why they haven't done things you think they may have needed to do, and then that entire record becomes the record on which, you make your final determination.
Fred, was there anything on paper in Singapore that would be helpful? Like, would it be helpful? Do they have a measuring tool, their RFA, et cetera?
Yeah, Mike's been working on that.
Okay.
And they did have a process, and their preliminary document was 800 pages, where they, not surprising, where they laid out everything that they were looking for. But
Fred,
Mike,
sorry. Mike,
sorry.
we get the,
Sorry, yeah, no, they had a preliminary document of about 800 pages where they laid out their criteria as the starting point, and then Mike has been looking into how they did their evaluations and the process that they went through, so.
Yeah, I guess this certainly is, anticipates question 35.
Right.
But, yeah, so one last point on an earlier point is one of the reasons why I believe that domestically, why some of the states did not really follow through with a good question and answer session as to the quality of the applications is that in hindsight, it appears that the overwhelming criteria in those states is often just simply how much gaming revenue and which application is going to generate the most gaming revenue and kind of cut it off there. And everything else becomes somewhat of a significantly lower priority, and that's clearly not the case here. Singapore was clearly different, and based on our client relationship and our person on the ground in Singapore, made some initial inquiries. And again, in response to question 35, they did, and they are, to our knowledge, the only gaming jurisdiction in the world to have done so, but essentially used software that's used in many other industries to evaluate ostensibly subjective criteria, qualitative criteria with respect to gaming. The only gaming jurisdiction to apply that is it's called analytic hierarchy process, and it's used in any number of industries. The only reason Singapore used it is that their defense ministry was familiar with it. They used it in procuring defense-related contracts. So they did apply this, and it's a very interesting, it holds promise, but Singapore, and I'm in the process of getting more information with some of the precise criteria that Singapore applied. But it's a promising tool among many other tools, but we were cautioned, and we cautioned in turn, that it is but one tool in the toolkit. And again, I'm in the process of getting more information, but one of my initial concerns, one of my initial questions in this, and to avoid a heavy reliance on any one tool, is that we've experienced in multiple markets that an application may put forth certain aspects of its particular proposal that were simply not anticipated. We saw that, for example, in Illinois, where we represented an applicant for a license, and this particular applicant was in the city of Waukegan, and down on its heels city that had certain aspects of it that would have had certain public policy benefits that others didn't. And it wasn't anticipated, and consequently, in my view, wasn't sufficiently addressed. So it's going to be a helpful tool. It's going to hold out the promise of giving some order to what's, by definition, a disorderly process. but again, it'll be just one tool. And I'm in the process of getting more information with some of the specifics as to what Singapore's priorities were and precisely how they ranked them.
And I think in that regard, the Ministry of the Tourism Board was the one that made the final selection after integrity. And we're talking to the people in Singapore on the tourism board and some of their former officials as
The
well.
woman that we had dinner with, wasn't
Yes,
she?
Margaret.
Wasn't she there then, right?
She was the one who oversaw that process.
right.
And we've reached out for her as well.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mike, I had a question following up on your comment about other gaming venues, just looking at the revenue. How can you know that the revenue is correct unless you've looked at all those other pieces of the project?
Well, and that's an excellent question. And the short answer is essentially,
They didn't.
you look at the population, and you recognize that just in terms of this one is so much closer to such a larger population, that just essentially was a guiding criterion.
Thank you.
So I think we're, well, the one other piece, is there any other kind of development project that goes through this? John, do you think, are there other, do communities bid out pieces of property for big multi-use projects? Are there is there anybody else that does this kind of thing? That would do a review, that would have experience doing major multi-dimensional project analysis and evaluation and review?
A competitive one, you mean?
A competitive one, yeah, where you're gonna get multiple bidders for the same thing.
Well, I think for some of these large-scale projects, there are processes that, I'm sorry. For a lot of these large-scale projects, there are processes that are internalized. Like, for example, the city of Boston has a pretty well-developed process for reviewing these types of big applications.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, the BRA must have some kind of a process, because they get multiple bids for sites, right?
right.
Yeah, so that's a thought, there might be somebody or some,
But I think that the primary reliance is upon some of their own personnel.
right.
And doesn't private industry have design competitions? I mean, if somebody wants to build a building, don't they ask 3 or 4 or 5 or
Yes.
a bunch of people to come in and then have somebody who evaluates the designs for a whole bunch of criteria? That's a fairly frequent
Yep.
process.
Well,
too.
the designer selection board for the state does that for all public projects, and there's a designer selection board that interviews architects, and that's how they select architects. And they come in and explain their concept, and it's highly subjective, but it's tangible. They demonstrate understanding of the surroundings, understanding of the context, understanding of the goals, and they're selected on the basis of their qualifications.
And how do they do it in private industry?
I suppose in a similar way, except not in a public meeting.
No, but I mean, if you're gonna put up a, like some of these big buildings that are going up now for high biotech and high tech, they must go out and do that as well. I'm sure they do.
Yeah. I mean, there's.
And put together some kind of a reviewing team to analyze that.
It's a little, if you're gonna build a new building, if Biogen is gonna build a new building,
Right.
they would put it out for a competitive bid, a little
then-
narrower, but.
Right,
and
right.
Simpler, but,
But then have some kind of an analysis according to pre-selected criteria.
Right.
Yeah.
But all those solicitations, they're highly on the basis of qualifications, because everybody recognizes that lowest price doesn't
No, I
yield the
understand
best
that, I
quality.
understand that.
But all of that
Right.
criteria can be articulated in advance.
well, the other piece is the RPAs. I think what we need to do now is figure out how to proceed on this. We're gonna get to question number 35 as well, but we said this all relates. I think we agree with Commissioner McHugh's 3 steps here, 3-point recommendations. But really, the question is, how are we gonna take this to the next level? You know, how are we gonna operationalize this conversation? I don't know if we want to appoint a subcommittee to think further for the next couple of weeks about, or whatever, about how we can collapse this system of criteria/metrics with evaluation teams, with evaluation process. You know, that needs to be worked up and maybe includes reaching out to the BRA, the Designer Selection Board, or somebody else, you know, to think about ways that might be done. And maybe talking with more of a spectrum about Singapore. But I think we need to somehow designate somebody to start to put together a plan that can pull this all together.
Well, I think it does tie into the next one, which, as you'll see, is also full of really interesting, but difficult questions, and I think they do go together. And then how to reach out and find out what the selection, what the advisory board ought to be is, and how to go about engaging them as part of the same process. So I would be happy to participate in that with Commissioner Zuniga, if that was acceptable to the group, to try to come back with these 3 bullet points in mind as sort of major themes, and come back and drill down to the next level within a couple of weeks and see where we are, both in terms of the criteria, the approach to evaluation, and an approach to how we're going to get the criteria into a application in sufficiently definitive form so that we can move through the applications we get with some speed.
Right, both, yeah, they're all, it's completely organic, because if you design an application form properly, then the process of reviewing it sort of suggests itself. But those 3, all the way from the criteria to the process of review. I think that'd be great if the 2 of you would work on that for, you know, a couple of weeks, whatever it takes to take a crack at that. And if you want to, if as part of that, why don't we delegate to the 2 of you the decision to spit out an RFP quickly if you feel that should be a part of that process.
Okay.
As a brief reminder, we did have that quick solicitation that we declined for a financial advisor. So there's a lot of work there that we will build on.
Right. Okay, so McHugh and Zuniga. Great. Right, you want to go?
Let's be clear that this pairing has no decision-making authority, just for the record. It is purely an information-gathering group in which we're going to gather information, think about it, digest it, and come back with recommendations here with no decision-making authority.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. You want to skip to 35?
Yeah, 35 really follows on 20 and is something that I have been, I think is a fascinating question, and one that is equally difficult. The question is, should the Commission formulate and communicate a scoring system prior to the receipt of proposals with the relative weight of different criteria? Should the Commission establish a minimum scoring for applicants? This is, of course, a scoring for the applications that we receive, for the RFA2 applications that we get. We received 4 responses. One from Sterling Suffolk Racecourse, which says that basically Section 15 of the Gaming Act outlines a number of criteria that are sort of self-defining. They're minimum requirements that have to be met. They're not all entirely self-defining, but many of them are. Section 18 has, Sterling Suffolk Racecourse says, has a number of criteria that are more open-ended, more subjective, but they say that any ranking or scoring of them would not aid the commission in its RFA2 determinations. Such determinations are by their very nature evaluations of multiple and varied consideration that are best left to the commission's discretion. That's the essence of their response. Shefsky and Froelich had essentially the same response, that the statutory criteria give one all the information that is needed, and I'm paraphrasing now their response, but that's the essence of it. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council said a list of the general topics to be included in the scoring system should be communicated, but the relative weights and other technical aspects should not, because people might concentrate on the things that have the highest weight and not concentrate on the things that the commission intends to give lower weight to. And then an individual, Joshua Levin, said that minimum standards should be established and scored, and any project that doesn't meet the minimum should be rejected. This is a difficult issue for me, and I think perhaps for all of us, for two reasons. The first is simply trying to figure out what kind of an evaluation process would be most helpful. There are 4 models that I found, but in talking with Michael Pollack the other day, at least exchanging email, I came on this 5th, which is the AHP model used by Singapore, about which all of us know very little at the moment, but are going to follow up. But the 4 models that I included in here were the one used by the Pennsylvania Gaming Board, which just has a verbal assessment of each of the criteria that they designate. And their opinions, and I've got several samples now that the General Counsel sent me, are over 100 pages long. They take each of the criteria that they're looking for from each of the applicants, they verbally analyze it, they verbally compare it, and then at the end, they have a verbalization of their reasons for awarding a license to a particular applicant. And they do that in order to maximize the discretion that the statute gives them and not be confined arbitrarily to a pigeonhole in terms of value as they process the applications. So that's one model. A second model is one that is intriguing, but is found in the Maryland statute itself. The Maryland statute has 3 criteria for the award of a license. And each of the criteria has a series of statutory sub-criteria. And they assign to the criterion, the major criterion, a weight. And to each of the major criteria, a weight. 70% for one, 15% for the other 2, to add up to 100. But they don't assign any weight to the individual components of that criterion, thus leaving the commission free to assess, unless it self-defines further, assess the subcomponents of the criterion in any way they deem appropriate, but ultimately give a lot of weight to one and lesser weight to the others in making their ultimate decision. Missouri's taken a third approach, one that is heavily numbers-driven, but only for the component of the application that deals with the economic criteria. And there they picked a number of factors that they were interested in hearing about. They asked each of the applicants, and that was a competitive process, you'll recall, each of the applicants for their worst projection, average projection, and highest projection. And then they ranked those on good, better, best, not by numbers, but they ranked them comparatively. Such things as how many employees do you expect to have at the end of X period of time? What's your worst case scenario? What's your likely scenario? And what's the best you could possibly do? And then they ranked those after evaluating them to see whether the numbers were real. And then they used that to decide who had the best economic proposal. There were other parts of the proposal that they didn't deal with that way, but this was for the economic proposal. And that's set out in the gaming consultants. The full set of criteria in Appendix 17 to the Gaming Consultants Strategic Plan. The most complex overall approach was taken by the Pittsburgh City Planning Department for their 3 casinos, and I've appended what they did to the memo. Their actual final matrix is the last 2 pages of that memo. But basically what they did was this, and I think I can verbalize it. They picked 6 criteria. They assigned to each criterion an equal weight. They then picked a number of sub-criteria for each criterion and assigned to each of the sub-criteria a weight. And then they had each of the 5 analysts individually score each of the sub-criteria. They multiplied they added the scores together, divided them by 5 to get a weighted or an average score. And then they multiplied that score by the weight assigned to that criterion. They added up all those weights, which turned out to be a weighted average assessment of the criterion, totaled them all up, and that was the score for each part of for each of the 6 major criteria. Then they added up all the scores for the 6 major criteria. Whoever came out to the top was the best.
I don't remember, was that the final decision, or was that a recommendation to a political entity who then made the final decision?
That was a recommendation to a political entity that then made the final decision. And the Pittsburgh process came a cropper because, is that a signal that somebody disagrees with that?
You're right.
The Pittsburgh process came a cropper because the entity, the selection board, picked the entity that got the lowest score, had the biggest financial problems. That entity went bankrupt and was succeeded by another. So it didn't work the way it was intended by the Pittsburgh Planning Department. Interestingly, for the design criterion piece of it, at least, there was a civic design review board, we heard from one of the members of it at our AIA presentation, that looked at the design criteria and selected the best design on the basis of purely verbal assessments of a number of factors. Didn't use any numbers at all. And they came out with a different entity having the best design. It seems to me that insofar as real numbers are concerned, that is, numbers that reflect some aspect of the applicant's operational behavior, number of jobs, anticipated revenues, anticipated infusion of capital into the community, construction costs, those kinds of things, that comparisons and numbers-driven analysis is really helpful, and that a form ought to be designed so that you could get a handle on that. And that will take care of a great number of the criteria. Insofar as more amorphous things are concerned, the design criteria, for example, and if you look at page 5 of the memorandum, the site design is the third major characteristic down there. Giving a numerical score to those, it seems to me, simply gives the aura of certainty to something that is entirely subjective. It may be subjective among all 5. All 5 may agree on the subjective analysis. We may disagree on the subjective analysis. But giving it a number doesn't really help us wrestle with the ultimate outcome. And therefore, I think that would not be helpful, to have a numbers-driven process. Overall, it seems to me, if we rely entirely on a numbers-driven process, we risk, as I think we've discussed before, either missing something and awarding the license to somebody who doesn't really have the best proposal, or facing the difficulty, the perception difficulty of making a choice that we're not going to award the the license to the person with the highest score, and then having to explain why we didn't, in which case the question arises, why did we have the scoring in the first place? So that's one piece of the problem that I thought about as I was preparing this. The second piece is, and this is much more elusive, how do you devise a system, whether it's purely numbers driven, whether it's numbers and evaluation driven, or driven in some other combination of factors, that really takes account of the comparative overall attractiveness factor. How do you, for want of a better word, capture the wow factor that we're all trying to get, the kind of intangibles that you were talking about, Mr. Chairman, in the memo you circulated, that would be our equivalent of the building that draws people from the region because they want to go see the building, or the complex that draws people, or the package, the relationship between the casino and the surrounding community, and the way the casino channels people into other attractions. How do you get a handle on that and make an evaluation of that in a way that really serves our purposes of getting the highest and best value? And I don't have, candidly, a good answer for that, or even a recommendation. My recommendation, with that caveat, is that we finalize as promptly as we can the criteria that we're going to use, because ultimately how we approach this piece depends on what criteria we pick, that we determine which criteria focus on operational numbers, numbers that really have a meaning in the operation of the casino, and try to design something that gets those numbers in a comparative basis, that we not attempt to use numerical weights in other areas, and that we go ahead and design a form that will help us capture the numbers where numbers are useful, and that we not have a minimum scoring, even if we have minimum criteria that an applicant must meet in order to proceed, and that we think further about this and revisit it too when we're finished the criteria. So that was kind of a windy recitation.
Well, it's great. It's great. I mean, it's really interesting stuff and really complicated, and there's no right or wrong. So this rolls right up into the project that we just asked you guys to take a stab at. So I think that within that context, I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything you've said here. The devil's in the details, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, for the most part.
Hey, Brandon, would you do me a favor? Run and get a cup of black coffee. Anybody else?
No, I'm all set. Thanks.
Thanks.
Brandon, hot tea?
Yeah, for the most part, I think it's laid out well. It's well researched, and I think it illustrates by our estimation, by my estimation, that people have wrestled with multiple forms elsewhere. I would tend to favor the numbers approach, but I think I've made that point, perhaps, given my background. And do recognize that there's qualitative merits that are very hard to put a number to. In looking at Pittsburgh in detail, I think part of the challenge there may have been that they were really granular when it came to each of the criteria, especially on those that are qualitative in nature. I mean, I'm not exactly familiar with each of the three responses, but they talk about existing structures. It's conceivable that one of them didn't have an existing structure, and how are you going to award that point as an NA or as a 1 if you don't have it? So much would have to be thought out for each one of those. So when it comes to site design or building design, I think it's best to still have a score, but have all of the attributes that go within it, either by questions or by articulating in the form of response what would count where applicable towards that broad criteria, rather than trying to go down and assign 1 point or a half point to each of those. I recognize that, that there's difficulties in assigning 1 point, if you will, out of 100 on something that could be very similar, let's say, across applicants. If I could, however, I do agree, of course, perhaps without surprise, that when it comes to economic benefit, there's a lot more, a lot easier to quantify numerically if we put parameters around it. For example, I suggest that we dictate a discount rate when it comes to all economic projections, revenue projections, so that different applicants don't use different discount rates, and therefore we find ourselves trying to figure out, which discounted cash flow is more beneficial. Another example in that venue would be to ask applicants to only project for the life of the license. 15 years for the type 1 and 5 years for the type 2, because that's the life of the license that we would be doling out, rather than letting applicants make their own assumptions as to how far their projections should go. But aside from putting parameters around that, I think there's a very measurable, ultimately one number for each of the criteria that we can come up with financially: jobs, economic benefit, tax revenues, etc. So I would favor the mixed approach, if you will, ultimately trying to come up with us a total score by virtue of adding up all the components, recognizing that there are those that will be quite broad, objective, and we just
Well, I
have to
think
find out.
you and Commissioner McHugh come at it with a slightly different sort of predisposition, not hugely different, but a somewhat different predisposition as to how much weighting is plausible and desirable. So, as you come up with some ideas for us, some recommendations for us, you'll have to sort of synthesize that, which will be helpful. And I'm saying, I think as a place to start, this is perfectly reasonable, makes sense to me. I'm a long way from settling on exactly how to do this.
Me too.
Yeah.
We will.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah, when you look at the Pittsburgh model, and they didn't use it, obviously. They went against what was recommended, and if I look at these things and how they scored them, I guess their non-gaming uses would be other amenities, and that's the same score as the building materials. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense to me how they scored this.
I agree. And how these each are all 20,
Right, right.
Socioeconomic, which includes job generation and so forth, is the
Correct.
same as site design.
But they don't even really get into, even in socioeconomic, they don't really get into generated revenue.
Yeah,
They
right.
don't really address that. So I see why they didn't use their own model, but it
But I think
does
it's an interesting
point out the
tool.
drawbacks,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, it does both. It does both. I mean, it's something to work from, which is helpful, but it shows the limitations of the device. And how on earth you ever decide the macro numbers as well as the micro numbers, the criteria and the sub-criteria.
Yeah.
But we gotta do it, so.
I would
Well,
just
we
highlight
start-
that.
Can I just, before we lose that thought, we start from a position where we have 19 factors already spelled out in the statute, so
Right.
that's a starting point.
Yeah.
And then those are evaluative factors, and then we add to that another 18 or 19 that are go, no-go factors from section 15. So we start out with a
Right.
big list of stuff that we've got to put into these categories, and so some of that,
Yeah.
we've got a head start.
That actually is, it's almost like when you do an RFP review, you do a completeness review, the first phase of this review might be the go, no-go things. You can stop early on if you don't get the 19 go, no-go, and then we get to the other, or something.
Yeah, no, and to the extent that there's any factors that have very little weight, those could be set as prerequisites. Let's say everybody comply with these.
Right.
I would only point out that there's merit behind their numerical approach in the process that they followed, which was this consensus, this weighted average. Everybody come with a score, and you know, much like I guess they do in the Olympics, you could devise a number of ways to do that. Discount the highest. Yes. Discount the highest and the
Yeah.
lowest, average the three. There's any ways to do that.
We'll get that French judge.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Which again is highly subjective, but they
Right.
get around to it numerically. I guess.
Where's Tonya Harding when you need her?
I'll tell you, I really like Guy's idea of a presentation.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes that makes a lot of sense in
No.
explaining, because reading it sometimes, or even looking at a visual, doesn't have the same effect as hearing it
Totally.
explained.
Yeah, that's definitely, I agree with that completely. Okay, so we've done two and got a good project underway. Key policy question number 6. Let's see, that's not me, that is, who's that?
That's me.
Okay.
The question being, should the commission use, what should the criteria, again, a criteria question, should the commission use to determine whether a gaming license applicant should receive a gaming beverage license for the sale and distribution of alcohol? And I allude to the relevance section under Chapter 23K, subsection 6. We had 7 submissions on this question. Sterling Suffolk said the commission should incorporate by reference in its regulations the standards currently utilized under the Commonwealth in Chapter 138. Joshua Levin said local officials should absolutely be, I don't know if he got his questions confused.
He was in the
or
wrong
not.
question, but I took him into account when I got to my project, my question.
Paul Vignoli said casinos should pay at least what they pay in other states. They should also be required to obtain host community beverage and entertainment licenses. Philip Cataldo said the commission should set the beverage license as a separate license that can be rescinded for cause at any time and not at the end of the gaming license. Criteria should be set by the Gaming Commission, ABCC, and host communities together. I will also state that no alcohol should be served free or at a discount. Martha Robinson added alcoholic beverages take the edge off intellectual acuity. There should be no permission given for free alcoholic beverages at any gaming establishment in Massachusetts. MGM Springfield said Massachusetts has some of the most effective alcohol control laws in the country, and the ABCC has proved to be a dutiful oversight supervisory body. Operators will essentially follow the same regulatory guidelines as established alcohol license holders adhere to now. And Shefsky and Freilich, on behalf of the city of Springfield, said the stringent suitability and investigation that a gaming license applicant must go through to receive the gaming license is much more stringent than the typical alcohol beverage licensing investigations. Therefore, any applicant receiving a gaming license should also receive a gaming beverage license for the sale. Commissioner Cameron and I met with the leadership of the ABCC and asked for their input on this question. Their recommendation, similar to what other jurisdictions have done, is to adopt their controlling statute, which is Chapter 138A. By adopting 138, we would be covering both everyone inside the gaming establishment and outside equally. The ABCC recommend the casino license is also the licensee for the gaming beverage, so any request in the change of casino licensee would also require approval for change of the gaming beverage license. We also had a number of questions and conversation about operating restaurants or the hotels within the same property and how they are to be treated. The ABCC is currently working on this issue and trying to identify a best practice. They referenced what they're undertaking with Massport, whereby the licensee is actually Massport or the Massport operating entity, but they have sub-management agreements with anybody within that terminal or building that's distributing alcohol. But they said there might be other additional best practices that we might be able to replicate.
Does Massport, so can Massport in effect take Legal Seafood's license away by penalizing them as a subholder?
They have, as I understood it, they have somewhat of a management agreement between whoever the restaurant is
Right.
distributing alcohol and whoever's holding the license.
But the Massport holds the license, I thought you said.
Yep.
Or the entity
Yes.
operating the Massport, either on behalf of them or Massport themselves. And in trying to, we understand that in the footprint of the property, you're going to have multiple amenities, you're going to have multiple restaurants, multiple establishments serving alcohol. There is some onus that can be placed on the license holder because they will not want anybody essentially in their footprint that would misbehave or behave inappropriately with respect to the use of the license, with the threat of being able to revoke the license, essentially.
I think they're actually revisiting that whole policy because of that reason.
Right.
One license, but if there's one particular restaurant or facility that has a number of violations, they are jeopardizing the license for everyone, so that is problematic.
Yeah. Well, unless, as I said, unless they delegated, unless they delegated the authority to Massport to lift the sub-license in effect, but.
It's not unusual in a casino complex. As a matter of fact, the present trend is for these casinos to enlist the celebrity chefs to open up their own restaurants within the casino. And what is often done, typically, is that those restaurants will lease space in the casino. And as the lessee, they obtain their own liquor licenses from the commission. They'd get a casino alcoholic beverage license, but as a separate licensee from the casino. The casino restaurants, the ones that are owned and operated by the casino, would be within the casino's liquor license. But the ones that are owned and operated by a third party who is leasing the space would have their own independent license. And now, obviously, if the casino is aware of all kinds of violations that are going on, they can be penalized for that. But there's an independent license held by the third party.
You know, ABCC was looking at our statute and interpreting it, that would be one license for the facility. And we'd have to look at that and see if their interpretation is correct, but that's the way they were interpreting it, which would allow us to have that same issue, one license, many users, or management agreements. So it would seem to me that it would make much more sense if they had their individual license, they're responsible on their own
Right.
for the enforcement
Right.
piece.
Plus other goals of the commission, like furthering workforce development, would not be circumvented by virtue of perhaps just leasing out space, right?
Meaning?
Meaning, if we awarded, like we will, the license for alcohol to just the gaming operator, let's say, and they leased space to a celebrity chef restaurant or whomever. Our goals for workforce development, let's say, would reach back to everybody, not just the alcohol and gaming licensee, but all his or their lessees.
That's right.
Maybe it goes without saying, but we want to make sure that is not circumvented.
Wouldn't you have a disincentive for a major capital investment by a celebrity chef, say, if the chef knew that its license could disappear because of what some other independent vendor did?
I think so, yeah. That would be, and typically they have those types of restaurants have their own methodologies and their own systems and their own personalities, and they don't want those interfered with. The lease, whatever arrangement they have gives them independence, in a sense, in the way they can operate that facility. Right. They would not want to be dependent on how someone else does something in another part of the facility.
Right.
So I just want to make sure I understand. Is the assumption that then under our operation there would be room for multiple licensees, like different operators in different restaurants.
I think we need to look at that statute and
If the
interpret
statute
it the
permits
way
it, that would, I think our suggestion would be that would be the best practice if the statute allows it.
Allowed. If 138.
It would be the best practice if you had the owned and operated under one license and the and the lessees under separate licenses.
Yes.
Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. I, for one, don't know enough about this to make an intelligent, I think this is starting to get us to think about it, but probably at some point, there's a bunch of other ABCC questions, and I'm sure there'll be more, and at some point, I think we're gonna need the ABCC to come in here and talk with us, hopefully with some more knowledgeable people too.
Well, and I think it would be important for us to have all of you take a look and give us your
We'll do that.
interpretation as opposed to ABCC interpreting it
Sure.
one way.
Will do.
I think
Looking
they
at
had
the
a-
relevant sections of our law.
Yes.
Okay.
They were mindful, and one of the points they raised, and I think Commissioner Cameron put this in one of her write-ups, is that, they want to make sure that if it's, for example, illegal seafoods operating within a casino footprint, that legal seafoods is treated similar to the legal seafoods that might be 4 blocks away.
Right.
How do you treat them both just because they're on a casino property, that they're treated fairly and equally as if they would be offsite?
Did you have something you were gonna?
Well, for whatever it's worth, one thing that's really interesting about Massport is even though that comes
Elaine,
under
we
state
need-
jurisdiction.
I think we need you to, get the mic.
One of the things that's interesting about Massport, even though it comes under state jurisdiction and it's largely state police jurisdiction, BPD, so they had local license enforcement for all of the restaurants and even like the Delta Sky Club, for example. It was all local enforcement as opposed to state police. So I don't know how that affects.
So if you had trouble inside one of the restaurants, Boston Police would come? Is that what you said?
Well, it's complex in that if you dial 911 from inside the airport or a Massport facility, it's state police jurisdiction. However, Boston Police had jurisdiction over the licensing. So they would go in there and handle all licensed premise violations, even though it's a state facility. Why that is that way, I don't know, other than to know that they all, Legal Seafoods, Delta Sky Club, every single restaurant in there, all had licenses that were overseen at the local level by Boston Police.
Was that just liquor licenses, or was it?
Everything.
Food licenses?
Entertainment, liquor, everything. So any licensed premise violation came from Boston Police.
Okay. So the licenses must have been issued by the city of Boston.
So,
That's it.
Sorry. Were you, thanks.
Yep.
Were you suggesting the consultants take a look at our statute as well as 138 to see what that?
Well, I think
how
just
you
our
think-
statute and how it's interpreted as one license to the,
Okay.
the casino establishment or the ability to issue many licenses.
But they might also look, I mean, if ABCC is recommending that we adopt their controlling statutes, which is Chapter 138, we might as well get their views on 138 as well. See what the pros and cons are of doing what ABC recommends, which is adopting their statutes to control our facilities.
And along those questions, I guess, is this management agreement scheme the result of limited licenses, or is it convenient to operate it that
I
way?
do think it was a result of limited licenses. Is that your understanding from the
Yep.
meeting we had?
In terms of the other half of the question, they brought information to us about application fee we should charge. Other states use different formulas. It can be based on a hotel room. It could be based on just a general flat fee, but there wasn't any tried and true formula to say this is what you should charge as a license fee. The fee amounts went from a couple $100s up to a few $1,000s in terms of the license fee.
ABCC's different licenses?
Plus what they did, I credit them on doing some good homework in terms of looking at other jurisdictions almost on our behalf, but Colorado was, $1,000 initial license fee and renewal of $500. Delaware was $3,000 biannual. Connecticut was a base fee plus $100 per guest room in the hotel. So there wasn't exactly one model to follow that we could point to.
Okay, so we're gonna keep working on this one, basically, I think, is the bottom line.
Yeah, we
You're not-
had this meeting last week, so we didn't have a chance to get through 138.
But it's-
Welcome the chance to walk through 138 with our consultants.
But your recommendation isn't quite as clear as this. And it sounds like you're really saying, let's keep looking at this, let's look at 138, let's think about it some more, but rather than that we use the existing regs.
There might be some of the regs that might work, some of the regs might not work.
Yeah,
but
okay.
it's worthy of evaluating 138. But again, I think it's a fair position for us to take that, again, if one entity is operating within the casino footprint, that they would be treated equally if they had a facility anywhere else in the state or outside of the casino footprint.
Yeah, I guess, unless the circumstances are different. I mean, if you're able to give away free drinks, for example, I don't, if the privilege that go with the license are the same, then the responsibilities should be the same, right? But if the privileges are different, then the responsibilities might be different too.
Right.
And they might very well be different. The privileges might be different inside the casino. It's 24/7, for example. What does that say? I mean, that's a reason maybe to look at a legal seafood license differently in a casino than you would look at it in a, I don't know, it's just.
But the liquor license isn't 24/7.
Oh, it's not?
No, it's 3 in the morning. I'm trying to remember. It's
Mhm.
not. I think there's a
It's a
5-hour
cutoff.
cutoff.
Yeah.
Who wants to stop drinking at 3?
Who wants to start drinking at 6?
Between 2 and 8.
Between 2 and 8.
Okay.
That's right.
So 6 hours.
6 hours.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're ready, gonna keep looking at this one. Key policy question number 14, I think that was Ombudsman Ziemba, one of the Z team, the Mass Gaming Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So key policy question number 14, the question is, should the commission require that a developer use a specified percentage of in-state or regional employees in the construction and operation of its facility? We didn't receive that many comments on this question, but I'll go through the ones that we did receive. Paul Vignoli said yes. In summary, he recommended that all available non-managerial jobs should be given to qualified applicants to host communities and to surrounding communities, and that managerial jobs could go to non-local employees. Shevsky Freilich for the City of Springfield said no. We believe that this matter should be left to the host community and determined by the community in the negotiation of the host community agreement. Martha Robbins said yes, although she did say that this may not be legally possible. And Philip Cataldo said yes as well. In terms of discussion in this item, it's quite obvious that the Gaming Act is replete with references to the importance of hiring Massachusetts citizens. It's replete with references to job creation as a major activity of the Gaming Act. Specifically, MGL 23K 18.4 requires the commission to evaluate how each applicant proposes to implement a workforce development plan that utilizes the existing labor force, including the estimated number of construction jobs a proposed gaming establishment will generate, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the submissions by applicants, the Gaming Act also states that all of the licensees shall have an affirmative obligation to abide by every statement made in their application, and this would presumably also include the workforce development plan that is submitted by the applicants.
There are a number of arguments both in favor of establishing a minimum and against establishing a minimum, at least at this time. Without a minimum, applicants may not hire a significant percentage of local residents, either in the construction or the operation phase, thus defeating one of the major objectives of the Gaming Act. Even though the Gaming Act is replete with references to how employment should be a major objective, it is only one criteria, and hiring locally is also one criteria that would be evaluated by the commission. The establishment of a minimum has precedent. The precedent that we did find was in Ohio. However, I've been unable to find a specific reference either in their statute or in their regulation that makes it a minimum requirement. They had a 90% hiring requirement, but I believe that that was upon the request of the applicant and that they are being held to their commitment in that regard. But perhaps it exists in some sort of an agreement between the license, but I wasn't able to find that in their statute. One of the other considerations is that local hiring requirements, they are very commonplace in Massachusetts for tax increment financing agreements. Very often, communities will negotiate with businesses that want to locate there on the overall number of employees that would be coming to the state and the number of employees that should be set aside for the local jurisdiction. There are numerous arguments against establishing a minimum. Licensees do have a strong incentive to hire local employees without a minimum requirement. Especially in regard to conversations that they'll be having with the local community, that'll obviously be a very high priority. A requirement could result in operating complications such as poor gaming performance due to less experienced workers. I think there is an example that you might have cited in that regard, Commissioner.
I cited an example?
Well, in our conversations, we talked about how in one of the regulatory conferences, a very high percentage of workers might have an impact on performance.
I'll give you that example. What it was is in attending the investigations track in Las Vegas, they talked about Ohio. Because of the 90%, they were very inexperienced when it came to investigations, enforcement, and they had all kinds of cheating scams early on that they were forced to bring in some experienced people to properly train and monitor the situation. So they were cautioning new jurisdictions to make sure you had enough experienced people on staff so that would not occur.
Because of competition in each of the regions, I think each of the applicants will be further incentivized to try to promote local hiring as part of the application process. The hiring, as we've noted from the comment from Shefsky, the hiring of local residents is a potential likely concern in community agreements. It would be very difficult to define what percentage you should have for each of the regions because there are different percentages of economic activity in each of those regions. And would you define a specific percentage for the whole state, or would you have to take a look at the regional activity within each of those regions? And lastly, the commission could, after evaluation of all of the activity that it's trying to do right now to promote local employment, take a look at it at a later date beyond our RFA 2 process. So for those reasons, I recommend the commission not establish a minimum at this time.
How do we enforce this mandate from the legislation?
Well, I think it's going to be a criteria in each of the applications, and we will hold them, all applicants, to numerous things that they include in their application as conditions of our license.
Commissioners, then consultants.
Okay. Well, I think to append to the recommendation and to perhaps answer your question, I think the commission should request periodic reports on that document two things, that document their efforts and how they match against the promises made in the workforce development plan, document actual efforts ongoing to hire locally, and also report on the results that they obtain. And if we do that over time, which is perhaps what John is alluding to, I think it will have the effect of the applicants doing everything they can to further those goals. So again, it goes back in monitoring, the process of monitoring. If we make it a point to request the documentation of their efforts to hire locally and the results, and we publish in our website those reports every time we require them, I think those two steps would go a long way towards incentivizing positively.
But it seems to me that there is a rapidly declining ability to measure. I mean, what the law calls for is, in effect, maximum utilization of, quote, existing labor force. As soon as somebody moves into town, they're part of the existing labor force, and certainly 6 months later, they're part of the existing labor force. And if a whole bunch of people move to town because they think there may be new jobs, and you measure them 18 months later, you have to, there have to be, how many people are you employed who lived in the town 6 months prior to opening? Is that what you're measuring? Or it becomes, it seems to me that the point of real contention is the startup. As time passes, it's going to become more and more local as the workforce gets more and more mature. But the real issue is in the initial construction jobs and the initial hiring. That's the point of maximum impact. And I don't know exactly, I'm mixed very much sort of as the description is here about the pros and cons of a minimum. But I do think somehow we want to put real teeth into, at least maybe it's in the criteria, maybe it's in the evaluation criteria, because it's clearly one of the things the legislature cared about the most. And then make sure that in that first blast, that first 1 to 2 years really, that they live up to their promises. But
I point out, Section 21 of the Act, subsection 12, requires us to collect an annually, requires licensees to collect an annually report to the Commission a detailed statistical report on the number, job titles, benefits of employees hired and retained in employment at the gaming establishment. So we are supposed to collect a great deal of information, but what we could further require is potentially ask for the residency of their workers as part of our evaluation and part of the reports that are submitted to us.
But as I said, that has less and less meaning as time goes by.
Right. But I mean, if you take a look at over the 15-year term of a license, if those employees become Massachusetts residents, you are benefiting those Massachusetts residents.
Yeah, right, but that's not what the law is talking about right now. It's talking about today, people who who need jobs now. That's what they're talking about, not people who 15 years from now moved in and became residents. But anyway, I think we understand that.
I think you have I think you got to establish two different categories. I mean, the second category being the operational phase of the casino. Right now, we don't have any casinos in Massachusetts. So we could conceivably say, for the most part, there aren't a lot of Massachusetts residents who have the skills or the abilities to work in a casino. The startup side, we know that there are people with suitable construction skills anxious for this work, and as Commissioner McHugh and I heard in Western Massachusetts, there's a fear in that region of too much of an importation of people for the temporary jobs to get that work. Whether this commission could kind of set a statewide criteria, I think to follow in your recommendation may not be appropriate, but for that particular region of the state, that type of criteria in the temporary job period would be an appropriate place in the host community agreement to say, we have people here that can do construction. We don't want to see a big importation. We want to take advantage of the existing workforce. And maybe that gets built into the host community agreement as the building trades out there have suggested to us. But moving forward, and having been in municipal economic development and tried to tie job creation to these tax increment finance deals, it's tough to tell an employer, okay, you're going to have 200 machinists. Well, you got to hire all 200 from Springfield. But if we can't go out and find 200 people that want to be machinists, then what does the employer do? You know, I'd be anxious to see workforce development plans that kind of grow from a core out, grow from that host community out to say, okay, we'll try to recruit from Springfield. And we know we're going to have hopefully an adequate workforce development program in the partnership with the community colleges to funnel people through. Okay, if I can't find them in Springfield, I go to the surrounding communities and I kind of build out from there until we're maximizing employment kind of outside of that core for Massachusetts residents. But I think we need to look at this as the operational, or the startup space, the construction space where we know the employment's available versus the operational silo of casinos where most people, unless they're commuting over the border to work at one of the establishments in Connecticut, we know we don't have that skill base. So, you know, kind of separating out the two, but again, leaving it really into the hands of the local host community agreements to fight for what they need to fight for in terms of maximizing employment. But we should be mindful of those plans that kind of, again, build from that core out to make sure we're maximizing employment opportunities in the immediate regions where these casinos are going to go.
It seems to me that I agree with what Commissioner Stibbons has said. We could define in the criteria what we mean by the evaluation criteria. Jobs to people who have been Massachusetts residents for 6 months before being hired, something like that. I mean, you could figure out those criteria. But I'm curious about the reliance on the host community agreement to do this, because part of our mission is to ensure that the development benefits the region as well as the host community. And so it has to be, we have to be thinking, don't we, about a regional draw and a regional utilization of workers and a regional distribution of benefits as well. So how does the host community agreement play into that?
It's a good question, and now you think beyond that further in the statute where it talks about, I mean, labor harmony piece as well. And I look at the labor harmony piece as having a direct correlation with, you know, the construction trades. And I think we'd all guess that not one of these projects isn't going to be done in some concert or some coordination with construction trades. Defining how it might wind up in a host community agreement or even a surrounding community agreement, I don't have an answer to.
I agree with Commissioner McHugh that we can't rely on just a host community agreement. And I know from New Jersey that these jobs are regional. Probably 5 counties in New Jersey commute to Atlantic City easily. I can count them off, you know, so, yes, so.
And again, tying a, we had experience working with Smith & Wesson over a tax deal, and we never held Smith & Wesson as they expanded and got this tax benefit to hiring a certain number of jobs, but they needed to demonstrate a good faith effort that they worked with the Regional Employment Board, they went to the Career Center, they went to the Vocational Technical High School. Again, a person may choose to go work for an entity for any number of reasons or may decline to go work for somebody for any number of reasons. But to show a workforce development plan that was, again, kind of started locally and built out from that core community, I think is something we ought to look at. And again, there's some reliance on that employer to really be making a good faith effort, but at least to have a strategic plan to say this is how we hope to accomplish our goal. I think there's many ways they can do that and be specific about it. But again, I see a difference when it comes to the casino jobs versus the construction jobs.
But Commissioner, you mentioned labor harmony. I believe that you had some testimony at that meeting that you attended where some of the labor representatives said that they would have conversations with a lot of the applicants and licensees about hiring locally to the best ability that they can. And you could contemplate that that would also be part of the applicant's materials that would be submitted to the commission for its review. So that's not entirely baked into a host community agreement. It might be a separate agreement, it might be a separate plan of the workforce development plan, but it would all be included in the overall agreement that is submitted to the commission.
I think our gaming consultants wanted to speak to this issue.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about Ohio and Maryland, which we're most familiar with. And I think it evolved in Ohio in a way that was very positive, and I will say that licensees there were very responsible in terms of three aspects: the construction of the facilities, the hiring, and then the vendors they used, the purveyors, the vendors that they used for the casinos. And it was tied into equal employment opportunity options as well, because they go hand in hand. And the hiring, for example, in the Cleveland casino, which was an urban casino, was targeted for the local counties and the local community to give everybody at least an opportunity. If I recall, they had 12,000 applicants for like 1,000 jobs that were whittled down ultimately to the group that they hired on the employee side. And every 2 weeks, at every commission meeting in Ohio, there was a presentation by Columbus, by Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Toledo as how they were doing in terms of the construction, the minority participation, the local hirings, the hiring of local vendors. And it kind of built a momentum at the end of the day where everybody was acting with a very common goal, both the regulators and the licensees. And I think that was a very good success story. And it goes, I think, first to the submission that they make, and then holding them accountable to that submission.
I think that's a really good point. Somebody suggested periodic reports. Periodic reports during the hiring and construction period is a really good idea. That's when it would be really telltale. That's a great suggestion.
And getting, as I understand it, what you were saying, the people to come in and give the reports in a meeting.
Yes, right.
Yeah. That's
great.
Can I?
Sure.
Sorry, I just want to build on something that Commissioner McHugh alluded to, but I think it's very important. If we were to define or just state publicly that local hiring at least 6 months or a year of residency, not immediate, just to further answer your question relative to that immediacy,
right.
I think that would also be helpful.
Yeah.
I think much more beyond that might be unreasonable or impractical, but demonstrate in some fashion, document that there was such residency.
To add to that point, I think there's potentially some good information we can ask an applicant or licensee at some point to offer us. It, can have anything to do with the demographic background of the individual, whether they were chronically unemployed before, how long they might have been unemployed, where do they live, did they see an increase in their income by moving into a career in the casino. I think there's some more specific data we can build off of as we go through that kind of reporting period. But that again, as Commissioner McHugh and I heard, that construction period, knowing that there is not a contractor in Western Massachusetts who's bonded for the size project that we're talking about. Their biggest fear was an outside contractor coming in and essentially going to the local construction trades and say, okay, I got 150 electricians, I need 5 more. What can the local economy offer? I think that is where the Western Mass Group has been pushing to say we need some requirements that will have first crack at jobs as opposed to somebody coming in from another state.
Michael?
Yeah, just real quick, an alternative means of advancing the policies that are implicit in this question and the statute is to make it clear that training at the earliest, a training program, a robust training program at the earliest, that commences at the earliest possible date is a high priority in the evaluation criteria. And I say that for 2 reasons. One is, Mr. Chairman, is the reason you mentioned that if I move into a community tomorrow, even within that 6-month window, I'm on equal footing with existing residents, and I may even actually have more marketable skills. The other reason is that a training program that's robust and includes the indigenous local population at the earliest possible date proves to be less disruptive to the community later on in terms of people moving into a community, and that puts all sorts of, we've seen this in Connecticut as one example of what not to do, puts all sorts of demands, unanticipated demands on public schools and other factors as a result of that lack of advanced planning. And I'm using Connecticut as an example. We did a detailed study there. As one of the consequences of that is that the existing pockets of unemployment and underemployment remained essentially to a great degree untouched by the creation of these jobs at these casinos, and the communities that surrounded the casinos were faced with problems that they did not anticipate in schools and so forth, housing demands, zoning violations, and various other things that could have been prevented had there been planning in advance with a training program that identified where they were going to get these workers from, who they were at the time, and how they were going to get the skills, and how they were going to get access, physical transportation access to the casinos.
I think we referenced the community college training program that we've been all working on, and when we have questions about whether or not we'd just be in the host community agreement, it's my understanding that a number of the Western Mass applicants have signed on to work with the consortium of community colleges on that type of a training program. So my suggestion and the recommendation here is that as commission that we concentrate on those types of efforts as we have been to see what we can do in advance of the opening, concentrate on the application materials through a discussion of the criteria that we'll be evaluating, make it known to the applicants how important this is, and then as a follow-up that we can focus on getting back the data. Admittedly, that is beyond that initial period, but the kinds of reporting that we talked about doesn't have to only be annual reporting. It could be a meeting with the applicants as we go forward. Right. And then you could reserve the ability to set a minimum percentage if indeed all of those efforts are not working satisfactorily.
Right. Right.
Can I ask one more, just to go
Sure.
here a little bit?
Sure.
One last point. Guy and I obviously support John and Bruce's recommendation. We just wanted to point out that in Section 1818, the portion about the applicant's affirmative responsibility to demonstrate it has a contract with organized labor and the support of organized labor for its application. And it goes on in the end to indicate that whether the applicant has included detailed plans for ensuring labor harmony during all phases of the construction, reconstruction, renovation, development, and operation of the establishment. Point being that to a certain extent, this drives the applicant, okay, to establish those relationships that will have inherent in them a significant amount of local involvement. I could also add to it that we've been involved in construction projects involving casinos where major out-of-state contractors come in, and they do bring with them some experts. Sometimes it's a project manager and some other positions. But we have been pleasantly surprised in a great deal of most of our experiences that I can recount and remember readily, where the number of local craftsmen were not originally anticipated, but where projects came in with estimates maybe 50% local, ended up 70 and 80% local, simply because of the needs of the project. And while they had direction, in some cases expertise in some areas, the local involvement was quite big. Here you have the added incentive of the labor component and the demonstration of the applicant, which we think would even be more helpful.
Yeah. Just I realize we're going to be licensing all these people or registering all these people something, so we actually have a built-in, built-in monitoring mechanism if we want to use it that way. I hadn't even thought about that before. Okay, good.
Mr. Chair, if we're ready to move to the next,
Yeah.
can I ask for a brief recess?
Yeah.
We're going to accept the recommendation, right, that we not have a minimum, but we're going to use various monitoring requirements and incentives and encouragement to hire an indigenous workforce wherever possible.
And to continue to work on this, I think, in all the various ways we've just talked about, yeah. And we're gonna have, within a month, we'll have a director of
Right.
workforce development and so forth,
right.
who will take this on, I think, and run with it too.
Right.
Great. Thank you, Ombudsman Ziemba. Yes, let's have a 5-minute break. Okay, we will reconvene public meeting number 47. And I will go next on key policy question number 21. Should the commission issue regulation or policy statement dealing with the portion of general law providing that the commission may not award a gaming license if it is not convinced that the applicant has, quote, provided convincing evidence that it will provide value, close quote, to the region in the case of a Category 1 license and to the Commonwealth in the case of a Category 2 license. We got 7 comments on this. Paul Vignoli said, yes, we should issue such a reg. Sterling Suffolk said that convincing evidence would be have to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So to set some kind of a broad policy or regulation statement didn't make sense. Shevsky and Freilich said policy or regulation would be duplicative sections in the Act. Furthermore, that if we did write more expansive rules and regs, that may provide a basis, an additional basis for litigation. Metropolitan Planning Council said yes, that we should make clear that adding value and benefit is a requirement. Joshua Levin said that the city should be required to provide convincing evidence that the casino will provide value to the region. Martha Robinson said yes, and the statement should be crafted in open meetings, and Philip Cataldo said yes. This one did not take us very long. We did talk about it. I did talk about it with the consultants and with Ombudsman Ziemba, and we don't think that there needs to be any clarification on this point. I think everybody well understands that the law says up to 1 license per region. We have clearly been talking about the need for convincing evidence of value. Furthermore, we set out competition as a critical way to get value. We got the competition. So it is clearly my recommendation that we not pursue this question any further. Any other thoughts?
I would just agree. I think the competition will certainly assure that there's value in every project.
And we all know full well our authority, we have the authority to negotiate on our own if we wish to. Anything else?
I agree for all those reasons.
Okay. So we will adopt that recommendation. Key policy question number 46 is also mine. Should the commission prohibit gambling by local officials in casinos located within their jurisdiction? I have a recommendation. I'm open-minded, though. I think this is kind of a complicated question to figure out where the appropriate equities are. There were 6 public comments. Revere said existing laws already provide ample protection, therefore no. Paul Vignoli said yes, simply restating the point that officials shouldn't even enter any casinos on official business and should never be allowed to receive casino gifts or awards. Sterling Suffolk said no, that we should use the required code of ethics first. Interestingly, Sterling Suffolk went on to say that, quote, no jurisdiction prohibits officials from gambling in local casinos. Shevsky and Freilich said, yes, we should prohibit that it is best practice, and it's customary in many jurisdictions. Martha Robinson said no, and local officials gambling invites further corruption. Philip Cataldo said no. As I said, as the public comments demonstrate, there are widely varying opinions on this issue, even as to whether or not such a restriction is common practice in other jurisdictions. Our consultants do point out that, in their experience, most tribal casinos do prohibit gambling in those facilities by tribal officials. And our consultants also pointed out, which is a very important point, that our local officials have quite a bit more authority than most other local officials, albeit most of that authority will be executed up front. Nevertheless, there is an ongoing relationship that's non-trivial. We looked at various we talked about the possibility of simply no restrictions at all. There was quite a bit of conversation about maybe putting a restriction only on credit or comps, so that you could, a local official could go into a facility and gamble, but they could not have credit extended, they couldn't have any kinds of comps, or prohibiting gambling altogether. With Mr. Ziemba's help, we referenced question 31, which I think he and Attorney Grossman did a lot of work on, which basically recommended that we not issue further ethics rules for municipalities, aside from whether we have standing and the ability to do so, that there are lots of rules on the books prohibiting municipal officials from, for example, accepting anything of value intended to influence an official act, et cetera. And even in one section, appearing to speak to the issue of an appearance of conflict, because it's impermissible to act in a manner that would cause a reasonable person to conclude that a person can improperly influence or be influenced. However, having said all that, it just doesn't feel right to me. I mean, it seems to me that the appearance of a local official with some significant authority regulating a local casino to be in that casino gambling just doesn't smell right, A. And B, there is the real possibility of somebody getting in trouble or being tempted. It's an environment where we all know temptation and trouble is part of the world. So both for appearance purposes and the possibility of a problem, I come down thinking that we should prohibit local officials from gambling in the facilities within their jurisdiction. The next question, if we were to go that way, is what is in a local official? And we'd have to define local officials. And I talked about at least the mayor, the town manager, the city council, the selectmen, zoning board of appeal members, and possibly people within the tax divisions, the revenue divisions, who might be involved in either assessing property or negotiating abatements. And there may be others, and I'm open to conversation on those. But that's a question. I didn't answer that in detail beyond that. So bottom line, my recommendation is that we do prohibit it by local officials, and that we carefully define local officials as any local official who really has some kind of a material regulatory authority over that local facility. Other thoughts?
Well, I generally agree for the reasons of appearance and everything that you state. I was initially personally open to either number 2 or number 3, recognizing the fact that it's really the extension of credit that is the most troublesome, if you will, for the reasons that you articulate. My question would be one of enforceability, and I don't know how we go about monitoring, if the onus would be on the applicant, if the onus would be on the local official, beyond what already is there on the state ethics laws and whatnot. That should not preclude us from coming down on the area.
When you say enforceability, you don't mean at the retail door. You're talking about what would the penalty be? How do we penalize?
No, even before that. So if, let's say, we issue a policy statement or put it in regulations that people are precluded, and then further define those positions, what is likely to happen? I mean, I guess most officials would likely comply, but what of those that don't know about it or didn't realize that it applied to them or chose to ignore it? What?
One of the fundamental rules in the modern day casino is know your customer. So the casino knows once a person reaches a relatively low threshold who their players are, and there's certain required information they have to get. Notification on the political end or to the people you know, obviously could be sent to them or notified or somehow. But once you're in a casino, the casino knows at a certain level who you are and gets certain information. And like in most other jurisdictions, if you're on a prohibited list,
Right.
or an exclusion list, or a voluntary exclusion list, or this list, the name's gonna pop up and appropriate action can be taken. So I don't think that is something
Okay.
that would be difficult down the road.
So in other words, the onus is on the applicant. They have the ability to monitor, the ability to enforce.
And they're doing that already.
Okay. All right.
Could you speak to other jurisdictions? I know the Chair mentioned it briefly. Is it all over the board on this issue?
It's all
Local
over the
officials?
board. I mean,
Okay, so-
you know, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In this case, as it was noted, the host communities have a direct role in the issuance of the license and ongoing issues. So it's a little different than some of
A
the
little
other
more,
jurisdictions where the locals don't have any, you know, major role.
Are there major jurisdictions, you know, the ones we always refer to, the Las Vegas, Atlantic City, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that do preclude?
Atlantic City allows the local officials.
They can't be issued credit.
They can't be issued credit, but they can play in the casino.
The Bahamas, for example, doesn't allow locals to, any native Bahamian can't gamble.
Right.
The Bahamas doesn't allow native Bahamians to gamble, so, you know, that goes to extremes. Just as a question, not necessarily, you know, in opposition at all to what is being proposed, is that how far would this necessarily extend? We're talking here about gambling only? How, are we talking about comps for dinner? Are we talking about just the host community, or are we talking about the surrounding community? I don't know if those questions had been addressed, and the question here is narrow to gambling, and appears to be just the host community. And that's certainly, as we say, we certainly agree with the conclusion that's been reached on that. But if the policy is to avoid the appearance of any impropriety, it may be worthwhile to consider extending that to comps generally, not just for gambling. But if you're sitting at the restaurant next to the mayor and he's getting bottles of champagne, that creates the same kind of impression as he would if he were, maybe more so, if he were just gambling.
Yeah, I mean, those, taking a bottle of champagne is probably covered under existing law, and under existing ethics rules. Either accepting something of value intended to influence, or a reasonable person might conclude that it would have an influence. So I was thinking of host communities, not surrounding, because they are the ones that have the ongoing regulatory authority, A, and B, I was thinking that just the gambling, because one of the things I mentioned here is, I can imagine, particularly in a smaller community, a more rural community, but any community, you know, the casino could become the place where things happen. You know, you have all kinds of activities, many of them not even involving gambling. So I don't think you'd want to preclude people from going in the building.
No.
And it wouldn't want to preclude local officials from eating and drinking, but you would want to preclude them from gambling. That's my thought.
But maybe no comps would be a good policy. That would doubly take away any temptation by either side. If there's no comps, whether it be entertainment, food, booze.
Right. And that would, it wouldn't, as you point out, if it's already prohibited on the part of the public official, it wouldn't impinge on the public official's activities any, but now you would be imposing a rule on the casino.
Yes.
That
Right.
the casino would have to apply.
Right.
And choose around sold-out concerts, boxing matches,
Right.
whatever the entertainment may be, that's,
Yeah. Anything that is given other than at a fair market value as would be provided to any other customer.
I know there's been New Jersey officials who have been sanctioned,
Yes.
fined for accepting comps?
Yes.
Indicted, okay.
Keep going.
Convicted? No.
I must say I'm very troubled by this recommendation. I think, on the one hand, for starters, it feeds into the government officials can't be trusted backdrop against which all of us operate in a way that's unwarranted. Secondly, it builds on, in a way that doesn't add value to, in my opinion, a whole host of regulations that prohibit improper behavior on the part of public officials. In the third place, it is at once over-inclusive and under-inclusive. The over-inclusiveness perhaps can be dealt with by defining municipal officials functionally, as you suggested, Mr. Chairman, as those who have some significant regulatory authority over the casino. But it's under-inclusive in that there are a host of other people who have an equal potential for affecting the welfare of the casino who would not be included. I'm talking about appointed officials, I'm talking about elected officials, I'm talking about people with the capacity to change the laws that govern the casinos that are above us. And it seems to me that to single out the local officials puts them in a special category that isn't warranted by their unique power to affect the welfare of the casino. It seems to me that a local official would be and would want to be careful about going into a facility in terms of the appearances piece of the existing state ethics legislation. But as long as he or she were able to do so in a way that didn't violate that appearances standard, and it seems to me that they ought to be permitted to do it. So I'm troubled by this for all of those reasons. I think that number two, a prohibition on extending comps or credit would perhaps be closer to a precise regulatory regime, but I would broaden that to encompass all public officials, quite frankly, because of the problem that exists or can exist with respect to a whole host of people who serve in jurisdictions beyond the boundaries of the municipality. But apart from that, I would let the state ethics laws as they currently exist do the job they're supposed to do, and not add to them in a way that, as I said at the beginning, I don't think really adds a great deal of value. The comp tickets kinds of things in Massachusetts, too, already have been the subject of extensive enforcement proceedings by the Ethics Commission. So that's my view of how to do it.
To pick up on Commissioner McHugh's point, I tended to look at option number two, being a former local elected municipal official and municipal agency person. You know, we're all familiar with the state ethics requirements. Where I saw number two was putting some onus back on the operator and maybe away from the public official to kind of keep both parties honest. And I looked at number two, if we're really standing up for the integrity of the game, of the games that we're regulating, you know, I kind of would put number three aside, but extending credit or offering comps or gifts or tickets or whatever is clearly a decision being made by the operating entity. It's not a game of chance or a game of risk of I don't know how fast they could run around and, fix a slot machine to, spit out a nice big chunk of change, but that seemed to me to be something clearly left with the discretion of the operator themselves. And I think our current ethics laws certainly speak to what a local official, both at the elected level and the appointed level and the municipal staff level, can and cannot do. I looked at number 2 as being reasonable in placing more onus on the operator themselves. I'm sure they would abide by it, but putting more equal onus or more onus back on the operator themselves to make sure that both parties are operating in an ethical manner.
Well, as I said, I'm mixed on this, and I'm very much open to conversation about it, but I think on the first point, on the public confidence, that this sort of saddles, this implies that people are bad guys. I think if anything, this would lean towards public confidence, in the sense, all 3 individuals who responded were opposed to the idea of letting them gamble. And I think it's a preventive step. It's a prophylactic step that shows public officials being responsible rather than besmirching them. I mean, I think the besmirching is already there, but this was us going out of our way to try to make this process be as clean as possible. And I think I forgot what your second point, the third point, that if there's a legal problem of distinguishing amongst these people, that's something I haven't really thought through. But we've talked many, many times about how distinctive this law is about the local control element of that. And sort of what I was saying before, with privileges go responsibilities. You're going to have, if you're going to have this much authority, I mean, think of the mayor of Springfield, the mayor of Boston, who are playing very prominent roles in this, and to have them be, to the public, to have them be seen, gambling in these facilities, in the facilities in their towns, just doesn't feel right to me. And it feels to me like these individuals, and as opposed to a state rep, say, or a DA, there's a lot of people would have other, some potential conflict, but as opposed to a state rep or a DA, the role that these individuals would have relative to the casinos is direct. I mean, really pretty close to almost a one-on-one relationship, and it's quite distinguishable from the whole panoply of public officials. So to me, I mean, I think I see the equities of those 2 points a little bit differently from you, but I also think, this is where I ended up, I just don't think it smells right, to let public officials who have a strong role in the regulation of these very, very controversial, challenging, difficult entities with infinite potential for temptation and problems, for us to let them go in just doesn't feel right to me.
Well, I agree that it's a value judgment, and I agree that it's not an easy, there's no easy answer to the question. It seems to me that the answer to the people openly gambling and winning big pots in these facilities is the power of the voters to deal with that at an appropriate time. I mean, we do have a democracy that takes into account those kinds of things. And I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm troubled about picking out a particular class that I believe is under-inclusive for this kind of a ban that is aimed at preventing expected deviant behavior.
Is that different than the regulators being banned?
For us, yes, I think it's very different. I think that our day-to-day existence is focused directly on those entities, and not only do we have appearance issues, we have the possibility of picking up pieces of information that may be inaccurate, people whispering in our ear, all kinds of bad things can happen from spending time in these casinos. And I think that ban has a much broader basis than the proposed ban here does.
Well, I go back to, the point that you've already made, but it's paramount in our statute starts with that, ensuring public confidence is the paramount goal. On that account, I would certainly be against the no restriction option number one, and understand the nuances that you point out, Commissioner, between the two other options. Maybe not so nuanced, but rather
Well, I think-
complex issues.
Any other thoughts on this? I think we understand what the issues are, but I think this one will require a vote. Why don't, I guess maybe the chair is not supposed to move, but why doesn't somebody, if somebody agrees, move that we accept the recommendation to prohibit gambling of local officials to be further defined, and, gambling and comps to local officials in the jurisdictions of a host community, local officials to be further defined.
Well, could you, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, could you split those two, because
Oh, I was gonna come back.
You
Okay.
agree with comps, but not with
right,
restriction.
and I don't want to be voting
Yeah.
against something that I'm then going to vote for.
No, I was gonna come, so if this motion carries, we're set. If it doesn't carry, then I was gonna say, then there's the issue of no comps and no credit.
Right.
So we'll come back to that.
All right.
And it's important to keep in mind, these are only policy-setting directions as we formulate Phase 2 regs. I mean, we may get overwhelmed with public opinion, which tells us to go in a different direction. I mean, this is for the purposes of drafting the Phase 2 regulations at this point, nothing more.
Yeah, we'll have many more bites at this apple, as we've discussed about all these things.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I understand.
There'll be a hearing process and so forth. Do you want to?
Well, I can move the first
If you- yeah.
motion, if that's okay. I would move that we accept one of the recommendations in this key policy question number 46 to restrict extension of credit to all local officials. Is that?
Credit and comps.
Credit and comps.
So we are splitting it up.
Well, I think we should start at the other end. Let's start at the
Okay.
broadest end and work
then
down.
further defined.
Right, so,
Well, I then move that, correct my motion, and then move that we accept the recommendation to prohibit gambling altogether to local officials.
and comps.
And comps.
Right.
To local officials, those in the host community, that they,
Right.
Second.
Further discussion? All in fa-
I take it it's implicit in that motion that further, public officials are going to be further defined.
yes, I'm sorry about that, yes, with the caveat that public officials will be further defined
Okay.
Right.
by the commission.
Okay, so all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
3-2. Okay, so we'll go with this draft for now, and see what kind of reaction we get. Okay, that was number 46. Number 7, Commissioner Cameron.
Yes, Mr. Chair. This question has to do with what regulation should the commission issue with respect to distribution of alcohol and the forms of identification that may be presented to a gaming licensee to demonstrate proof that a person has attained the age of 21. The law speaks to this issue. Notwithstanding any regulation to the contrary, a licensee under this section may distribute alcohol free of charge and for on-premise consumption to patrons in the gaming area or as a complimentary service or item in the gaming establishment, provided, however, that the commission, in consultation with the ABCC, shall promulgate regulations on such distribution and the forms of identification that may be presented to the gaming licensee to demonstrate proof that the person has attained the age of 21. And that such regulations shall include requirements relative to alcohol training certification for an employee who serves alcohol at the gaming establishment. There was public comment. The strategic plan does not discuss this issue. There was public comment. The first one is Paul Vignoli. All licenses should be required to have a door or greeting personnel at the entrance to the gaming floor to check IDs of all patrons. And he recommends the commercially available IDs. Sterling Suffolk recommends the commission issue regulations in conformance with Chapter 138, Section 34B. This is a similar approach to that was taken in New Jersey. Mohegan Sun encourages the commission to consult with all interested parties, including the existence casino surveillance and security personnel in New Jersey, local and state law enforcement agencies, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and other advocacy groups, insurance loss control experts, and many colleges and universities in the Commonwealth with existing or desired alcohol certification or training curriculum. Let's see, these regulations should be consistent, again, with 138-34B. And Mr. Cataldo, the same is used by other venues that serve alcohol in the state. We did discuss this issue with the ABCC in a meeting last week. They are recommending we be consistent with their existing laws. I think their existing laws are appropriate when it comes to identification and what their laws say, or a Massachusetts driver's license, a liquor identification card, a Massachusetts ID card, a passport issued by the United States or a government that is officially recognized by the United States, or a passport card for a passport issued by the United States, and military identification. I think that all of those are...
Not out-of-state driver's licenses, is that not enough?
Yeah, that's correct, they are not...
That's not enough ID?
Yeah, they're, that is an issue, I guess, you know, no, that is an interesting question. Gaming Massachusetts right now. Now, this is specifically from their law. That's interesting because we would expect a lot of out-of-state folks.
We're trying to get.
Yes, I know.
That's the whole idea.
Yeah, you know, yeah, you know, I'll be honest with you, I did not catch that, and,
I think you need, if you have an out-of-state
you need
license,
two forms?
2 forms of identification.
okay,
are
yeah.
required.
Okay,
Well, this was taken from their law, so that's interesting. They may,
that's where it does.
yeah, well, obviously, I think that you're right, we have to address that, and,
It's the reason we said not to adopt all of 138.
yeah,
Yeah.
agreed, that's a very good point. So obviously, I'm not gonna recommend then that we accept it without that, and maybe it is 2 forms of ID.
I believe part of the background for these
Yeah.
regs from the ABCC is the college, the population
Yeah.
in Massachusetts is one that is a lot out of state.
Right.
And different states may have different age, no, they're all 21.
Yeah.
And these regulations have been in existence for
They have.
some time,
Correct.
and we
Yeah.
now have a much better
Systems.
system for issuing
We do.
licenses.
That may be
It's
the
got
case.
national requirements.
That may be
Yeah,
the
that's
case.
true. Well, very good point, and so, you know, we'll have to, and maybe it will be 2 forms of identification. Obviously, we'll look at best practices from around the industry on this particular issue. You know, the difference between their laws and what we're able to do are the complimentary drinks. And that's clearly defined in the law as to what we can do with regard to free drinks, although we are, again, this is an issue where, in speaking to the gaming consultants, there are best practices in this area, and, you know, we certainly see the need, or the law allows us the privilege of comping drinks, and so according to best practices, we will do that. I did agree with ABCC, who talked about, now because our hours do close, so, you know, they thought that would be a severe disadvantage to local businesses if we treated the restaurants. Now, this is not the gaming floor, that they understand. It's typical to comp drinks, but in restaurants, and we gave the example of illegal seafood, somewhere on the gaming establishment, and there's another one right in town, in that particular town, treating them differently would be would serve as an adverse impact to that local establishment, and I did agree with that. So recommending that the restaurants themselves, we can adhere to the local laws with regard to serving alcohol. But the comp drinks in the facilities themselves, we just need to make sure we're following the industry best practices there.
Is there a sense of timing when regs along these lines would need to be drafted and incorporated?
We've submitted a
memo.
We've submitted a memorandum that I'm sure will be distributed that outlines the timing of the various phases of the regulations, with the Phase 2 evaluation rigs first, and the alcoholic beverage rigs are somewhat down the list because they won't be applicable until operation.
Okay. They wouldn't have any impact on an applicant's project or folks they might tend to try to attract?
No, very minimal. I mean, a marketing plan may be impacted slightly, but if we'd said there's no complimentary drinks, for example, that would, but that's the statute permits it, so.
Yes.
I can't see that there would be any material change in anybody's plans.
So we have time to work on looking at
Yes.
138?
Yes.
I think since we just had the meeting last week and have not had a chance to analyze all of their, and they did point out to us that several of their provisions are antiquated, and so I think it is wise for us to have an analysis and take the pieces that may seem appropriate, and then this is a perfect example of one that we may want to be more inclusive than just the identification pieces here. And again, that's something we can look at as far as best practices also.
There are a variety of programs offered that restaurants, training programs, tips program, for example, where they're training in the service of alcohol universally, not just in a casino, that the commission could consider requiring of a casino to give to its employees.
Well, so I was gonna ask, does ABC have regs that requires certification of an employee who serves alcohol to have alcohol training?
Don't know what they
okay.
say, but our law clearly says that we will.
We have to have that.
So
Right.
yeah, so.
So what ABCC gives us is sort of gonna be a starting point, and we'll work
Well,
from there.
and certainly obviously we'll have the law, which is
Right.
pretty specific in this area, other than, gives us the authority to decide what identification and whatnot, and what exactly will happen in each establishment.
Right, okay.
So, this is, again, one we'll need to spend a little more time on.
Yeah,
to
and
make
as
sure
we talked about.
analyze the best practices elsewhere and come up with something that makes sense.
Okay, that was number 7. 13 and 49, we're skipping.
I can speak to it briefly,
Okay.
if you don't mind, but I don't have a handout, but I'll just give a brief update and then suggest that the two questions be combined into one in general. These questions have to do with whether the commission should dictate and how audit requirements, record-keeping, financial records, as well as internal controls, plans, and the like. I did a little research. There's a lot of good cases out there from other states, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Mississippi. They have a lot of regulations that deal with internal controls. Our consultants have identified and speak to that a little bit in the strategic plan. And I think there's plenty of time for us to study and make a recommendation in the coming weeks or months, because this is not an immediate, in our view, issue.
Right.
It's an important one. It should be placed in regulations. In fact, other states do, which is where we were able to do all this research. But believe that we could come back to those.
Okay, fine. Policy question number 25, Commissioner Cameron.
Okay, this question has to do with operations. When should the regulations pertaining to operations on the gaming floor be issued, and what should those regulations contain? And more specific, when should regulations regarding dealer tips as specified in 23K be issued, and what should those regulations contain? I think as far as when, in both cases, we have a clear plan from the consultants, and it's part of this phase two.
Phase two of,
Phase two of our regulation drafting.
Of this draft.
All kinds of
Yes.
phase two.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
of the
Phase
art.
one would be the drafting of the determination evaluation.
right.
And then
Okay.
immediately thereafter would be the
So
operation.
it's phase.
Phase two of phase.
Phase two of phase two.
Correct.
That's
Phase
what I meant.
2B,
Okay.
perhaps.
Good, I agree with that. Most of your questions on here, I think, are phase.
They are,
Today and tomorrow.
They are, so the when questions have been clearly answered, and the what questions are really, there are best practices, but the law speaks specifically to this, and it describes certain operational requirements that the licensee must abide by, including security precautions such as cameras and visibility of the gaming area, hours of operation, efficient procedures to entertain the public, and with regard to dealer tips or gratuities from a patron at the table games with such dealer is conducting play, provided, however, so they may accept tips is what the law says. However, these tips or gratuities must be placed in a pool for distribution among other dealers. The commission shall determine how the tips and gratuities shall be set aside for the dealer pool, as well as the manner of distribution among dealers. No key gaming employee or other gaming official who serves in a supervisory position shall solicit or accept a tip or gratuity from a player or patron in the gaming establishment where that employee is employed. So that's very specific.
So remind me who key gaming employees would be,
Be like a pit boss,
Yeah.
So you-
senior department head.
and is that's, you don't tip pit
No
pit bosses?
tipping.
No,
Yeah.
they usually are salaried,
Right,
don't
okay.
participate.
Right. So that is in keeping with best practices,
Yes,
correct?
correct.
Yeah. Our strategic plan on pages 107 through 109 does speak about the requirements for personnel on the gaming floor. And the the consultants recommend the adoption of personnel best practices identified, levels of supervision, assignment of responsibilities of each to assure acceptable levels of customer relations management and the integrity of games operations. So we didn't think it was necessary to go through each position and what the regulation should say. I think
At this point,
it's
yeah.
clear that we want to adopt the best practices. We believe that we have a lot of information on what those are, and that will be part of this phase two.
We have sufficient direction in what direction you'd like.
Right, okay.
Yeah. There were some public comments. Let's see, Sterling Suffolk, they mentioned that they have already made their comments for question 24. Like I say, we know when we're going to get to this, and we are going to adopt the best practices. And again, the law is pretty specific on how we should manage tips.
Is it unusual for the regulatory body to mandate pooling of tips?
It's actually statutory in most jurisdictions.
Oh, it is?
The idea is not to curry favor with any particular dealer. This
Right.
way dealers can be given gratuities, but by pooling them, it's a fairer and perceived to be more honest way to do it. And in fact, very often the pooling process and the manner in which they're distributed is then later delegated to the dealers themselves. There's what's called a toke committee. They're called tokes in the industry. This is a legal toke. This is the committee then determines the distribution depending on the number of hours people have worked and so on.
Okay. Okay, great.
Question 26, Mr. Chair. When should regulations regarding issuance of credit be issued, and what should those regulations contain? again, pretty detailed in the law. A gaming licensee may issue credit to a patron of a gaming establishment in accordance with regulations promulgated by the commission. Such regulations shall include, but not be limited to, procedures for confirming that a patron has an established credit history and is in good standing, whether the patron has a good credit history with the gaming establishment, authorization of any credit instrument, methods for acknowledging a credit instrument and payment of debt, and information to be provided by the patron to the gaming establishment to be shared with the commission for auditing purposes. The law specifies that debt collection shall be limited to key gaming employees or attorneys acting directly on behalf of the gaming licensee. It further restricts debt collections of gaming employees who serve as junket representatives for the gaming licensee.
Further, that means debt collections by gaming employees who serve as, is that what that means?
It further restricts, is that what you're
Yeah,
referring
that's
to?
it. It further restricts debt collections by gaming
who
employees.
serve as junket representatives.
By instead of of.
Oh, by instead of of?
I'm not sure what you, I wasn't sure what you meant. If it's,
Gaming employees who serve as junket. It further restricts debt collections of gaming employees by gaming employees. Is that what you're saying?
There's usually, in the casino organization, there's usually
Yeah.
a collection department for the larger casinos, and they are employees of the casino, and then they interact with the private counsel that are hired to legally collect debts, should it get to that level. But the first line of attack is the collection department.
right.
Yeah, but the gaming
But-
employees are doing the collecting, not the other way around.
Right.
Which is why the chair says by gaming employees, right?
It restricts the debt collections.
Right, you don't want the pit boss collecting the money or
Right,
you
but
know,
it's the
credit
second,
department.
it's the second sentence that we're puzzling over.
Who serve as junket representatives for the gaming licensee.
Right. There would be, there's actually kind of two categories of junket representatives. There would be junket representatives who are employees of the gaming
You wanna come
licensee. Oh, sorry. Oh. There are junket representatives who are employees of the gaming licensee.
Right.
And then there would be junket representatives who are contractors with the casino licensee. You can employ a third party to arrange for junkets to the casino. So these would be employees of the casino who are junket representatives.
So
Maybe you mean
They are
two.
prohibited,
What's that?
they are, well,
Yeah.
I believe this is the exact language
You can employ
that the law says, but it isn't clear to understand that. So the way you read the law is that
Where are we
they
reading
cannot,
it?
those folks cannot collect debt, correct?
Section 27H.
Especially debt collection of
The second sentence.
gaming employees or attorneys restricts debt collection of gaming employees. It would be by gaming employees.
Yeah, by gaming.
Who serve as junket representatives for the gaming licensee, right.
So you would be precluding those folks
Yes.
from doing collections?
Yes,
Like the marketing department,
Okay.
that would be marketing.
Why would they?
It would be an incompatible function. The people who issue credit and collect credit are traditionally viewed in accounting terms that would be almost an
Yeah,
incompatible
okay, I see
function.
that.
Yeah. And not only the issuance credit, but the marketing people are trying to enlist people to come to the casino.
Yeah.
to do more, yeah.
This is a best
But
practice.
they won't issue credit. Marketing people don't issue credit.
Right, right, okay.
Our strategic plan does address this, specifically deals with gaming credit, pages 123 to 128. Easy credit serves neither the patron nor the casino operators well. Credit evaluation should weigh whether the applicant is employed, the number of years employed, whether he or she is retired or unemployed. Many states include their regulations, they include a framework for patron self-exclusion from all gaming or only credit. The regulation should also include the procedure for accepting credit applications, verification of the financial suitability of the patron, and procedures for issuance of credit to the patron found suitable. So we're going to get more specific than the law when it comes to writing this regulation,
And there are
correct?
definitely best practices in the
Yes.
industry for responsible credit issuance.
Right, yes, good.
I got it,
Uh,
I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna get into some of the comments.
Fine, go ahead.
And the only comment was from Suffolk, and again, they feel like they answered this question before, when they said that the law refer to the law. But we think we need to get more specific in the law and really be, ask more questions of the patrons before we issue credit, correct?
And there, and in terms of collection is that another issue? But no, in terms of collection too, there are often rules regarding how many days the marker or check can be outstanding and when it has to be
Right.
collected and those
Yeah,
kinds of
your,
rules.
your strategic plan is very specific
Right.
about, I summarized into a paragraph, but you do list all of that in the strategic plan.
Credit's one of the more controversial aspects of the industry. It's a necessary function of the casino, but
Why is it a necessary?
it just drives the business. A cash casino will do far less than a casino that issues credit on a responsible basis. It's just one of the drivers of the casino drop. But having said that, there's also a need for responsible credit, that it's done in a way that, the patrons are evaluated so that they can repay the debt. And there are services like, there's a company called Central Credit that handles most of the American industry that will evaluate the patron from a credit perspective. And that credit report is then put in the file for evaluation purposes. And as credit is increased in the casino, it goes up to additional approvals on the part of credit executives. So someone who gets a $500 credit might be done by a credit executive, or someone who gets $1 million in credit might be done by a credit committee evaluating that patron's ability to repay.
The importance of credit in the casino industry is really no different than it is in almost any other industry.
Buying a car.
You're buying a car or going into any store with a credit card. Any commercial facility would have a hard time if it didn't accept credit cards.
Just needs to be done responsibly.
Yes.
Responsibly, we all know stories
Yes.
years ago how.
The supermarket clerk with a $250,000
Yes,
credit.
yes.
This is related, and I don't know whether this comes up as another question somewhere, but I got a call a while back from a woman who was, said that she had frequent flyer benefits, frequent player benefits in one of the Connecticut casinos, and she was irate because they had lapsed them on her, and she felt like, and she was rational. She was just saying, as you begin to do this in Massachusetts, make sure they don't let us, let them cut us off from our. Do we get into that? Is that an area that we?
It's more, there's a lot of marketing. I mean, if someone hasn't shown up at the casino in 2 years and they have points, sometimes they
Points, yeah, that's
reduce
what it was, right.
those points or eliminate them. It's like the airlines. The airlines, if you don't fly that airline within 12 months, you don't have your points anymore. So
If there could be a general commission rule that they can't do it, or that any marketing program has to establish rules that are noticed to the patron, so they can't just arbitrarily terminate their benefits, but not to approve the specific language and the specific details of every marketing plan.
Okay. That's it. I think 3 of us have 5 o'clock meetings, so we probably ought to go. We could maybe squeeze in a couple more, but I don't think there's a need to do that. So, any other questions or issues about anything? Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.